Have you ever wondered what truly awaits us beyond this life? Is death simply an end, or is it the beginning of something far greater than we can ever imagine? Welcome to Serenity Path, where the mysteries of life, death, and everything in between unfold. In today's video, we'll dive deep into timeless Buddhist wisdom, unraveling the nature of fear, impermanence, and the peace that comes with understanding our mortality. These teachings have the power to change the way you live, how you face challenges, and how you look at death itself. It's not just about what happens after we die, but how we can transform our lives right now by embracing the impermanence of everything around us. This video is packed with life-changing insights. Make sure to watch until the end so you don't miss out on any part of this transformative journey. Trust me, the wisdom shared here could be exactly what you need to find peace, purpose, and clarity in today's chaotic world. If you're ready to embark on this journey with us, hit that subscribe button and share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's explore together the deeper truths that shape our existence. 1. The nature of fear. What are we afraid of? Fear of death is a pervasive and primal human experience. It's something that many of us will struggle with, whether we acknowledge it or not. But if we peel back the layers of this fear, we realize that what we fear isn't just death itself, but what it represents. The Buddha's teachings offer us profound insights into why we fear death and how we can overcome it. At its core, fear is tied to attachment, the attachment to the self, to our identities, to our relationships, and to the idea that we are separate and permanent. This fear isn't limited to the moment of death but stretches across our lives, subtly shaping our decisions, actions, and beliefs. The Buddha spoke of anatta, or the doctrine of non-self, which teaches that the self is an illusion. Our identities, the things we hold dear, our possessions, relationships, and accomplishments, are all temporary and fleeting. Yet, we cling to them as though they define who we are. Take, for example, a person like Steve Jobs, the co-founder of Apple. Jobs was a visionary, a man who created one of the most valuable companies in the world. But in the face of death, even someone with such incredible power and influence could not escape its inevitability. In his final moments, Jobs' thoughts were not on the money or fame he amassed, but on his family and the legacy he would leave behind. This reveals a universal truth: no matter how powerful we become, death reminds us of our inherent vulnerability. Fear of death isn't just about the physical process of dying. It's about the unknown. What happens after we die? Does our consciousness continue, or does it vanish into nothingness? These existential questions plague even the most brilliant minds. The ancient Greek philosopher Socrates, when facing his own death, famously said, "Death may be the greatest of all human blessings." Socrates viewed death not as something to fear, but as a natural and inevitable transition. The Buddha shared a similar perspective, teaching that death is not to be feared because it is part of the greater cycle of life. Life and death are inextricably linked, like the changing seasons. Each season has its beauty, and each has its end. Understanding this, the Buddha encouraged his followers not to waste their lives in fear, but to embrace the present moment and live fully. However, it's not always easy to embrace this truth. In the modern world, the fear of death often manifests in other forms: fear of failure, fear of not being remembered, fear of being insignificant. In truth, these fears are rooted in the same attachment that the Buddha warned us about: attachment to our ego, our achievements, and our place in the world. A significant aspect of the fear of death is the loss of control. We spend our lives trying to control our circumstances, our health, and our environment. The idea that death is beyond our control is unsettling. It challenges our sense of agency and power. The Buddhist approach to this fear is rooted in the concept of impermanence, anicca. Nothing in life is permanent, and death, like everything else, is a natural part of this constant flux. This teaching is echoed in the Stoic philosophy of the ancient Greeks. Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor and Stoic philosopher, once said, "You could leave life right now. Let that determine what you do and say and think." Marcus Aurelius understood that death could come at any moment, and it was not something to be feared, but rather something to be accepted. His words remind us that we should not live in fear of death but live with awareness of its inevitability. The Buddhist teachings emphasize that to overcome the fear of death, we must practice detachment, not from life itself, but from our attachment to the outcomes of our lives. We must recognize that life, in all its beauty and suffering, is transient. When we learn to let go of our need for control and our attachment to permanence, we begin to experience true freedom. An ancient Zen story illustrates this point beautifully. A Zen master was once asked by a student, "What happens when we die?" The master replied, "When you die, you return to the great void. But do not worry, for you have never left it." This story points to the reality that life and death are not separate, they are part of the same process. The fear of death arises because we falsely perceive death as an end. But, in reality, it is simply a transition, a part of the greater flow of existence. In practical terms, the teachings on fear and impermanence encourage us to live more fully in the present. This is not about waiting for death, but rather about embracing life as it is. It's about appreciating the moments we have rather than living in fear of the future. Take, for instance, the example of the famous spiritual teacher, Thich Nhat Hanh, who often spoke about the power of mindfulness. He taught that by practicing mindfulness in every moment, we can break free from our fear of the future, whether that fear is death or any other unknown, and live with clarity and peace. He would often say, "Feelings come and go like clouds in a windy sky. Conscious breathing is my anchor." This simple but profound practice of mindful breathing helps us reconnect with the present moment and detach from the fear that arises from thinking about the future. In essence, the practice of mindfulness, which is at the heart of Buddhist teachings, invites us to face the fear of death, not by denying it or running from it, but by accepting it as a natural part of life. Through mindfulness, we learn to let go of our attachment to the self, to our fears, and to our need for control, ultimately finding peace. Ultimately, the fear of death is not something that we can simply eliminate, but it is something that we can learn to understand and accept. By reflecting on the Buddha's teachings and the wisdom of ancient philosophers, we come to realize that death is not an enemy, but a teacher. It is a reminder that life is precious and that each moment should be lived with intention, awareness, and gratitude. As the great philosopher Epicurus once said, "Death is nothing to us, for when we exist, death is not, and when death exists, we are not." This paradoxical statement challenges us to rethink our relationship with death and, in doing so, to live more fully in the present. Through understanding and acceptance, we can transform our fear into wisdom, and our wisdom into peace. 2. Death and the Buddha's perspective. Is death really the end? Death is a concept that terrifies many, a finality that marks the end of existence. Yet, from the perspective of the Buddha, death is not an end in the way that most of us perceive it. The Buddha's teachings on death invite us to reconsider our understanding of life and death and challenge the conventional view that death is the ultimate conclusion of our journey. In Buddhism, death is understood as part of the natural cycle of life, a cycle that includes birth, aging, sickness, and death. The Buddha emphasized that everything is impermanent, anicca. Nothing in the universe, not even our own lives, lasts forever. To fear death is to ignore this fundamental truth. Just as the seasons change, so does life. There is a rhythm to existence, a flow that includes birth and death as two sides of the same coin. A prime example of this teaching comes from the Buddha's own life. Before his enlightenment, the Buddha, then known as Siddhartha Gautama, was a prince, living a life of luxury and pleasure. However, upon encountering the sights of sickness, aging, and death, he was deeply moved and troubled. His understanding of life began to shift. Siddhartha realized that death was not something to fear, but something to understand. He went on to attain enlightenment by embracing the impermanence of life, which included the acceptance of his own inevitable death. In Buddhist cosmology, death is not the ultimate end, but a step in the continuous cycle of samsara, the wheel of birth, death, and rebirth. This cycle is driven by karma, the law of cause and effect. When a person dies, their consciousness moves on to another life, influenced by the actions they performed in their previous life. The Buddha taught that the ultimate goal was not to fear death, but to transcend the cycle of samsara by attaining nirvana, a state of liberation from the endless cycle of birth and death. The concept of rebirth is fundamental to the Buddhist understanding of death. Death does not mark the end of consciousness, rather, it is a transition to another state of existence. This is quite different from many Western philosophies, which often view death as the cessation of consciousness and the ultimate end of an individual's identity. In the teachings of the Buddha, death is simply the end of one form of existence and the beginning of another. The consciousness, or vijnana, does not disappear upon death. Instead, it is carried forward by karma, shaping the next life. In this way, death becomes part of the continuum of existence, not an event that abruptly ends everything. To illustrate, we can look at the famous story of the monk Angulimala, whose life provides a vivid example of transformation through rebirth and karma. Angulimala was once a notorious bandit, feared by all for his violent crimes. However, after encountering the Buddha, he underwent a profound transformation. Through the Buddha's guidance, Angulimala renounced his violent ways and became a monk. When he died, his actions in life, his pursuit of spiritual growth, led to a peaceful rebirth, one where he would no longer be trapped in the cycle of suffering. The story of Angulimala is a powerful reminder that even in death, there is no permanent end to one's existence. Through right actions and wisdom, a person can change their karmic path, and death becomes a natural transition to a new opportunity for growth. Many Western philosophers and thinkers have grappled with the idea of what happens after death. For example, Socrates' ideas on death were not ones of fear, but of acceptance. He believed that death was either a peaceful nothingness or a journey to another realm, and in either case, it was not something to be feared. His views echo the Buddha's teachings in their understanding of death as a transition rather than a final end. In contrast, the Buddha's perspective provides a more intricate understanding of death that includes rebirth as an essential part of the process. The Buddha's teachings on anatta, the non-self, suggest that what we perceive as self is an illusion. This illusion creates attachment, which leads to suffering. By understanding that we are not permanent beings, but rather a collection of ever-changing parts, body, mind, feelings, and consciousness, we can break free from the fear of death. This teaching calls into question the idea of a permanent self that continues after death. Instead, Buddhism suggests that consciousness continues, but not in the same way we think of it. Rather than a continuous individual identity, consciousness flows into a new form of existence, shaped by the actions and intentions, karma, of the past. This provides comfort for those seeking peace with the idea of death, as it allows them to view death not as an ending but as a transition in an ongoing process. Understanding death in Buddhist terms is not just about preparing for the inevitable end, but also about how we live in the present moment. By embracing impermanence, we learn to live fully, without being attached to the outcomes. The knowledge that death is inevitable teaches us not to waste time clinging to things that ultimately do not matter. The Buddha's teaching that life is fleeting is a call to action, urging us to make the most of each moment. One modern example of this comes from the life of Steve Jobs, once again. Jobs, after being diagnosed with terminal cancer, became more introspective. His reflections on death led him to focus on what truly mattered, creating a legacy that would endure beyond his lifetime. Jobs' famous commencement address at Stanford University in 2005, in which he shared his thoughts on death, exemplified the Buddhist teaching on impermanence. He said, "Your work is going to fill a large part of your life, and the only way to be truly satisfied is to do what you believe is great work. And the only way to do great work is to love what you do." Jobs' acceptance of his mortality allowed him to focus on the present, on making the most of the time he had. This mindset is one that Buddhists cultivate by practicing mindfulness, living fully in each moment, without attachment to the past or the future. It is through this kind of mindful living that we can transform our understanding of death, seeing it not as something to fear, but as an inevitable part of the greater process of life. The Buddha's teachings on death are not intended to lead us to despair or to escape the reality of death. Rather, they encourage us to transcend the fear of death by understanding it in its proper context. Death is not an end, but a natural part of the cycle of life, a cycle we can escape only by achieving nirvana. Nirvana is the ultimate liberation from the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. It is a state of peace and freedom, where one is no longer bound by attachments and suffering. The Buddha's path to liberation involves the cultivation of wisdom, ethical conduct, and mental discipline, all of which can free us from the fear and confusion surrounding death. Through mindfulness, meditation, and the practice of the Eightfold Path, Buddhists aim to cultivate an understanding of impermanence, which allows them to live without the fear of death looming over them. The Buddha himself lived his life with the awareness of his impending death, and he encouraged his followers to do the same, not to fear it, but to use it as a motivation to live with wisdom and compassion. Ultimately, the Buddha's teachings on death call us to reflect on the transient nature of life. Death is not an end but a continuation of the flow of existence. By accepting death and the impermanence of life, we can live with greater peace, free from the fear that death might one day steal everything we hold dear. Through the lens of Buddhism, death becomes not something to avoid, but something to be understood and accepted. In doing so, we learn to live more fully in each moment, to live with intention, and to cultivate a mind that is free from the grasp of fear. When we realize that death is a part of life, we can truly begin to live with the clarity and wisdom that the Buddha encouraged us to embrace. 3. Attachment and the suffering we create. Why do we suffer in the face of death? The Buddha's teachings center on the idea that attachment is the root cause of suffering. When we speak of attachment in Buddhism, we refer not just to material possessions, but also to relationships, identities, and desires. We cling to things, ideas, and people, believing that they define us, give us happiness, or protect us from fear and loss. This attachment is particularly evident when we face death, either our own or that of others. The fear, grief, and suffering we experience during these times often arise from the attachments we hold. The Buddha described attachment as one of the three poisons, kleshas, alongside hatred and ignorance. Attachment causes us to bind ourselves to things that are impermanent, and because these things inevitably change, decay, and pass away, we suffer when they do. This suffering is not simply the pain of losing something or someone but is rooted in our mistaken belief that the objects of our attachment can bring us lasting happiness. In Western philosophy, this idea is echoed in the thoughts of existentialists like Jean-Paul Sartre and Martin Heidegger, who argued that human beings are often trapped in their attachments to things that give them false comfort. Sartre's idea of bad faith, where people deny the inherent meaninglessness of life and cling to superficial comforts, mirrors the Buddhist idea that our attachments blind us to the impermanence of existence. The Buddha's teachings, however, go deeper. He pointed out that it is not the loss of external objects that causes suffering, but the internal clinging to them. This attachment creates an illusion of stability and permanence in a world that is inherently unstable and ever-changing. By identifying with our possessions, our roles, and our relationships, we build a false sense of security that collapses when those things are inevitably lost. One of the most profound forms of attachment in Buddhism is the attachment to the self, Atman or the ego. The Buddha's doctrine of anatta, non-self, asserts that the self, as we understand it, is an illusion. The ego is a construct made up of our thoughts, emotions, and experiences, but it has no permanent existence. Our attachment to this self creates suffering because we see it as something solid and unchanging, something that must be protected at all costs. In the context of death, this attachment to the self becomes even more apparent. We fear death because we believe it is the end of our existence, the end of everything we identify with, the body, the mind, the relationships, the name, and the accomplishments. This ego-driven fear arises from our attachment to our identity, and this attachment makes us feel that death is a personal assault on everything that defines us. The Buddhist response to this fear of death is radical, to let go of the attachment to the self. By practicing mindfulness and meditation, we begin to see that the self is not as permanent or as solid as we think. In recognizing this, we learn that our attachment to the self is the primary cause of suffering. The Buddha taught that when we let go of the self, we free ourselves from the chains of suffering and fear. We begin to experience the world as it is, not as we wish it to be or as we mistakenly think it is. In the face of death, we experience suffering because of our attachments. We fear losing the people we love, the experiences we cherish, and the comforts we have accumulated. The grief we feel when a loved one dies, or when we are faced with our own mortality, arises from our inability to accept impermanence and to let go of attachment. This suffering is not just emotional but also deeply psychological. When we fear death, we fear the dissolution of the ego, the loss of the self. The concept of death challenges the very notion of who we are, and as a result, we experience a deep existential crisis. We try to grasp at life, to hold on to what we know, and this struggle creates more suffering. To understand this suffering, we can turn to the example of the Buddha's close disciple, Ananda. Ananda was deeply affected by the Buddha's death, and he was consumed with grief. He had been with the Buddha for many years and had developed a deep attachment to him. The Buddha, in his wisdom, reminded Ananda that everything in life is subject to change, including the lives of great teachers. He encouraged Ananda to see the impermanence of all things, to not hold on to attachments, and to continue following the path of liberation. In this moment, Ananda learned that his suffering arose not from the Buddha's death but from his attachment to the Buddha's presence. This lesson is one that each of us must face in our own lives. We experience suffering because we hold on to people, objects, and experiences that we believe are essential to our happiness. But in truth, it is our attachment to these things that creates the very suffering we wish to avoid. As the Buddha said, the root of all suffering is attachment. While the Buddha recognized that attachment is a natural part of human experience, he also taught that it is possible to free ourselves from this attachment through the practice of detachment. Detachment, in Buddhist terms, does not mean to become indifferent or cold. Rather, it means to let go of the craving and clinging that binds us to impermanent things. In the Buddhist worldview, attachment is like a vine that entangles the mind. By practicing detachment, we cut the vine and free ourselves from the grasp of craving and desire. This does not mean rejecting life or the people we love but rather understanding that they are not the sources of lasting happiness. The Buddha taught that true happiness comes from within, from cultivating inner peace, wisdom, and compassion. The Eightfold Path provides a practical roadmap to achieve this detachment. Through right understanding, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration, we cultivate a mind that is free from attachment and craving. This freedom leads to the cessation of suffering, as we no longer bind ourselves to the fleeting nature of life. One of the most poignant teachings the Buddha shared on this matter was his instruction to his followers to meditate on death, to reflect on the impermanence of all things. By contemplating our own mortality and the mortality of others, we begin to understand that death is not an event to be feared but a natural part of the cycle of life. The practice of meditating on death encourages us to live more fully, to focus on what truly matters, and to let go of the attachments that weigh us down. In the modern world, we can see how attachment creates suffering in the face of death. Take, for instance, the life of the famous actor Steve Jobs. When he was diagnosed with terminal cancer, he was forced to confront his own mortality. Despite his immense wealth and success, Jobs could not escape the inevitability of death. His story reminds us that no amount of material wealth or success can prevent death from coming. In his final moments, Jobs reportedly said, "Remembering that you are going to die is the best way I know to avoid the trap of thinking you have something to lose." Jobs' reflections echo the Buddha's teachings on impermanence and attachment. The things we hold on to, whether they are material possessions, our identities, or our relationships, are all impermanent. In the end, only our actions and the wisdom we cultivate in our lives can endure. By letting go of our attachments, we free ourselves from suffering and can face death with a sense of peace and acceptance. Suffering in the face of death is not caused by death itself, but by our attachments. The Buddha's teachings offer a profound path to understanding and transforming this suffering. By recognizing that attachment to people, possessions, and even our own selves creates the suffering we fear, we can begin to practice detachment. Through mindfulness, meditation, and the cultivation of wisdom, we learn to let go of our attachments and live more freely. By embracing the impermanence of life, we find peace in the face of death, and ultimately, we can transcend the suffering that death brings. 4. Living fully, how should we live if we know we will die? The knowledge that we will die one day is something we often try to ignore or push away. However, when we confront death directly, it forces us to reflect on how we are living and what truly matters. This awareness can serve as a powerful tool for living more fully, with greater clarity and purpose. From a Buddhist perspective, the recognition of death is not something to fear or lament but an opportunity to awaken to the impermanent nature of all things and embrace the present moment. The Buddha's teachings revolve around the idea of mindfulness and right action. In his first sermon, the Buddha laid out the Four Noble Truths, which address the reality of suffering and the path to its cessation. Central to this is the understanding that suffering arises from attachment and craving, and that the cessation of suffering comes through the cessation of attachment. By recognizing the impermanence of life, we can learn to embrace each moment fully. This is a theme that recurs throughout Buddhist teachings: life is fleeting, and every moment is precious. The Buddha advised his followers to live with awareness of their own mortality, not as a source of fear, but as a catalyst for mindfulness, gratitude, and compassionate action. In a world that values achievement, accumulation, and the quest for security, the knowledge of our mortality can seem like a cruel contradiction. How do we reconcile the fleeting nature of life with the desire to build a legacy, achieve greatness, or secure our future? This tension is at the heart of existential thought, and many philosophers have grappled with this paradox. In his seminal work Being and Nothingness, Jean-Paul Sartre contended that the awareness of death forces us to confront the nothingness that lies at the heart of existence. For Sartre, this awareness leads to a form of existential freedom. The realization that life is brief and unrepeatable empowers us to make authentic choices, unburdened by societal norms or preconceptions. In this sense, death is not something that ends life but something that can illuminate its true meaning. From a Buddhist perspective, this realization of mortality is not a nihilistic or bleak view of life, but rather an opportunity to engage in life more deeply and fully. The Buddha taught that by recognizing the impermanence of all things, we can cultivate a greater sense of urgency in how we live. When we are aware of the inevitability of death, we are less likely to waste time on trivial pursuits or to become ensnared by the illusion of permanence. If we know that we will die, how should we live? The Buddha's answer is simple yet profound: live with purpose, and live with compassion. Purpose gives our lives direction and meaning, while compassion helps us connect with others and transcend the narrow confines of the self. These two qualities, purpose and compassion, are essential for a life lived fully. Purpose, in the Buddhist sense, is not about achieving external success or accumulating material wealth, but about living in alignment with our true nature. This involves cultivating virtues such as wisdom, ethical conduct, and mental discipline. It is through these virtues that we develop a deeper understanding of ourselves and the world, leading us to act with kindness, patience, and equanimity. Compassion is equally central to Buddhist practice. The Buddha taught that true happiness comes not from seeking personal pleasure or avoiding pain, but from the selfless act of benefiting others. The Dalai Lama, in his writings on compassion, reminds us that when we are focused on helping others, we transcend the ego and its desires, finding joy in the well-being of those around us. In the face of death, this shift in focus becomes even more urgent. When we realize that life is short, we are less likely to become mired in self-interest or petty conflicts. Instead, we are motivated to live with greater integrity, to cherish our relationships, and to contribute positively to the world. The Buddha frequently spoke about impermanence, anicca, as a key principle in understanding the nature of reality. In his teachings, he emphasized that all things are in a constant state of flux, nothing stays the same for long. This is especially true in the context of life and death. Death is simply the end of one cycle and the beginning of another. In Buddhist cosmology, life and death are part of the same continuum, and the recognition of this impermanence allows us to embrace life more fully. This teaching can be difficult to grasp in a culture that prizes stability and permanence, but it is central to living a meaningful life. When we come to terms with the fact that nothing lasts forever, we can learn to let go of our attachments to things, people, and outcomes. We can also cultivate a sense of urgency, realizing that every moment is an opportunity to live more fully, to act with kindness, and to contribute to the well-being of others. One of the most poignant examples of this comes from the life of the famous Buddhist monk, Thich Nhat Hanh. Despite facing many years of war and exile, Thich Nhat Hanh lived with an extraordinary sense of peace, mindfulness, and compassion. He taught that we should live each moment as if it were our last, not in fear or desperation, but with gratitude and joy. For Thich Nhat Hanh, the awareness of death was not a burden but a liberation, a reminder to live with full presence and intention. Throughout history, there are countless stories of individuals who have confronted death with courage, wisdom, and compassion. One such story is that of the philosopher Socrates. In the face of death, Socrates did not express fear or regret but instead embraced it with an equanimity that is often considered the pinnacle of philosophical wisdom. Socrates saw death as a natural part of life and an opportunity to transcend the limitations of the physical body. In his final moments, Socrates famously said, "Death may be the greatest of all human blessings." Similarly, the renowned writer Leo Tolstoy, when faced with his own mortality, questioned the meaning of life and the best way to live. In his later years, he turned to spiritual teachings and embraced a life of simplicity, compassion, and mindfulness. Tolstoy's reflections on death, found in works such as A Confession, echo many Buddhist principles, particularly the idea that living fully is not about accumulating wealth or fame, but about living with integrity, compassion, and mindfulness. These examples demonstrate that when we live with the awareness of our mortality, we are more likely to choose lives of purpose, meaning, and contribution. We are reminded that death is not something to avoid or fear, but something that calls us to live more fully and authentically. To live fully in the face of death, we can take several practical steps, many of which are rooted in Buddhist practice. 1. Practice mindfulness. Being present in the moment allows us to appreciate life as it unfolds, without being distracted by worries about the past or future. 2. Cultivate gratitude. By recognizing the impermanence of life, we can develop a deep sense of gratitude for the people and experiences we have, knowing that they are fleeting. 3. Act with compassion. True fulfillment comes from helping others and contributing to the well-being of the world. By living with compassion, we transcend the limitations of the self and connect with the larger fabric of life. 4. Let go of attachment. The more we cling to people, possessions, and ideas, the more we suffer. By practicing detachment, we free ourselves to live more freely and authentically. 5. Live with purpose. Identify what truly matters to you, and let that guide your actions. Living with purpose brings clarity and direction to your life, helping you prioritize what is most important. The awareness of our mortality is not something that should paralyze us with fear or despair, but something that should propel us into a more intentional and meaningful way of living. By embracing death as a natural part of life, we can live with greater mindfulness, compassion, and purpose. The Buddha's teachings offer a profound path to living fully, reminding us that every moment is precious and that the true essence of life lies not in the accumulation of things but in the cultivation of wisdom, love, and peace. When we live fully in the knowledge of our own death, we transcend the fear that death brings and unlock the potential for a truly awakened life. 5. The wisdom of impermanence, how understanding death leads to peace. The concept of impermanence, anicca, is one of the central teachings of Buddhism, and it is deeply intertwined with our understanding of life, death, and everything in between. The Buddha often spoke of impermanence as a fundamental truth of existence. Everything is in constant flux, our thoughts, emotions, relationships, and even our bodies. The recognition of this impermanence is not merely a philosophical exercise, it is a profound source of wisdom that, when embraced, leads to peace and freedom from suffering. The Buddha's teachings on impermanence offer us a lens through which we can view the transient nature of life, including our own mortality. By truly understanding the impermanent nature of all things, we can cultivate a deeper sense of peace, not in spite of death, but because of it. This awareness allows us to live with less fear, more gratitude, and a greater sense of purpose. To understand the wisdom of impermanence, we must first recognize that much of our suffering arises from our attachments to things that are fleeting. We cling to our possessions, our relationships, our health, and our youth, as if they will last forever. However, the Buddha taught that this clinging only leads to suffering, because everything in the world is in a constant state of change. In his Dhammapada, the Buddha says, "All conditioned things are impermanent. When one sees this with wisdom, one turns away from suffering." This insight is the key to transcending our suffering. When we are attached to the idea that things should remain the same, we set ourselves up for inevitable disappointment, because change is the only constant in life. We fear death, not because death itself is inherently frightening, but because we fear the loss of what we have grown attached to, the people we love, the life we know, the identity we have built. This fear of loss, born from our attachments, creates a sense of dread and unease. Yet, when we embrace the wisdom of impermanence, we begin to understand that everything is fleeting, and this recognition brings with it a sense of liberation. We are no longer bound by the illusion that life should remain static. Instead, we learn to flow with the changes of life, accepting them with grace and wisdom. This acceptance of impermanence brings about an inner peace that can never be shaken by the fluctuations of life or the inevitability of death. In Western philosophy, existential thinkers like Martin Heidegger and Jean-Paul Sartre have explored the idea that death is an essential part of the human experience. Heidegger famously wrote about being toward death, which refers to the human awareness that we will all die. For Heidegger, this awareness is not something to be avoided or feared but something that brings us closer to understanding the true nature of existence. When we live with the awareness of our mortality, we can live more authentically, shedding the illusions and distractions that often define our lives. This perspective aligns closely with the Buddha's teachings on death. Death, for the Buddha, is not something that should be feared or mourned excessively, but rather something to be accepted as a natural part of the life cycle. In the Mahaparinibbana Sutra, the Buddha teaches that just as the seasons change, so too must life pass through cycles of birth, growth, decay, and death. Death is not the end of the journey, it is simply another phase in the endless cycle of existence. By embracing this natural cycle, we can live with greater peace, knowing that death is not an interruption, but a continuation of life's eternal flow. A significant aspect of understanding the wisdom of impermanence is the practice of letting go. In many ways, our attachments to people, objects, and situations are the root causes of our suffering. The more we cling to things, the more we fear their loss. By recognizing that all things are impermanent, we can learn to release our grasp on them and allow them to flow through our lives without resistance. This is not to say that we should abandon love, relationships, or ambitions. Rather, it means that we should approach life with a sense of non-attachment. This does not diminish our care or commitment, on the contrary, it deepens it. When we let go of the need for things to be permanent, we free ourselves to experience the full richness of life in its ever-changing form. The story of the great Buddhist teacher, Ajahn Chah, provides a powerful example of this wisdom. He once shared a teaching in which he compared life to a guest house. He said that the mind should be like a guest house that welcomes all experiences, both pleasant and unpleasant, without clinging to them. The experiences are like guests that come and go. By practicing non-attachment and recognizing the impermanence of each moment, we allow ourselves to live with more peace and less fear. When we understand the impermanence of life, we also let go of the fear of death. The fear of death is often based on the mistaken belief that we are separate from the world, that our identity is fixed and permanent. In reality, death is simply a part of the natural order. The Buddha teaches that all phenomena, including our bodies, are anicca, impermanent. By recognizing this, we come to see that death is not an end, but a continuation, a transition to another form of existence, whether in this life or in another. The Tibetan Buddhist teacher, Pema Chodron, has spoken often about the importance of facing death without fear. She emphasizes that by meditating on the impermanence of life, we can come to accept our mortality without panic or denial. In fact, she encourages us to prepare for death by living fully, which paradoxically helps us to let go of the fear of it. Death, she explains, is like a guest that will arrive one day, and when we greet it with acceptance, we are free from the anxieties that typically accompany it. The peace that comes from letting go of the fear of death is transformative. It allows us to live in a state of serenity, free from the constant dread of loss. We are no longer trapped by the belief that we must hold on to what is fleeting. Instead, we can appreciate life more deeply, knowing that every moment is precious, and that death is not the end but part of the greater flow of existence. Western philosophers, too, have wrestled with the concept of impermanence. Heraclitus, the ancient Greek philosopher, famously said, "You cannot step into the same river twice." His point was that everything is in constant flux, and nothing remains the same. This idea of constant change is fundamental to the Buddhist view of the world. The existentialist philosopher Albert Camus, in his work The Myth of Sisyphus, contends that the awareness of life's impermanence can lead us to embrace life with greater vigor. Camus writes that although life is ultimately absurd and death inevitable, it is precisely in the recognition of this absurdity that we find our greatest freedom. By embracing the transient nature of existence, we are liberated from the need for a permanent, unchanging meaning to life. Instead, we find peace in the moment itself. To live peacefully with the wisdom of impermanence requires mindfulness and reflection. It is a lifelong practice that involves embracing change, accepting loss, and finding contentment in the ever-changing flow of life. The teachings of the Buddha offer us the tools to cultivate this wisdom. Through meditation, mindfulness, and ethical living, we can learn to live with the knowledge that everything is impermanent. In doing so, we can find peace, not in spite of life's fleeting nature, but because of it. As the Buddha said in the Dhammapada, peace comes not by being strong, nor by striving to hold on, but by letting go of all attachment and accepting the natural flow of life. When we understand and accept impermanence, we become free from the grip of fear and attachment. We can live with greater joy, knowing that each moment is an opportunity to experience life fully, without the anxiety of permanence or the dread of death. In embracing the wisdom of impermanence, we find a peace that transcends the cycles of life and death, and we can live with an open heart and a clear mind, free from suffering. As we've explored today, death is not the end, but rather a natural part of life's ever-changing flow. The wisdom of impermanence teaches us to live fully, let go of our attachments, and find peace in the here and now. What if the secret to living a meaningful life is not to fear death but to understand it? If this video has inspired you, or if you have a new perspective on life and death, don't keep it to yourself, share it with others and keep the conversation going. I would love to hear your thoughts and reflections in the comments below. And remember, if you haven't yet, hit that subscribe button to stay updated with more insightful content from Serenity Path. Together, let's continue walking the path to understanding, peace, and enlightenment. Thank you for being a part of this journey. See you in the next video.